Thousands of international soldiers are in Africa's Sahel region, but despite this, there's been a dramatic increase in attacks by armed groups. So what's behind this upsurge in violence, and how will the international community secure the Sahel? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Foliba Thibault. The crisis in West Africa's Sahel region appears to be getting worse. At a meeting on Monday, the UN Security Council expressed alarm over the recent increase in violence and called on governments to provide more help. There are already thousands of French, UN and African troops in the region. Yet despite this, the Sahel's vast area that runs between 5 countries has seen a sharp rise in attacks by ISIL and Al Qaeda linked armed groups. Hundreds of people have been killed and many more forced to seek safety in camps. Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have suffered some of the worst attacks against their militaries, including one last week that killed 71 soldiers from Niger. Regional leaders have also held meetings this week appealing for greater international help. But will that be enough? We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Ahmed Idris in Bamako, Mali.
These are desperate times for Africa's Sahel region. Armed groups are inflicting heavy losses to armies and forcing thousands of civilians from their homes. Leaders of the countries affected, known as G5, scrambled this meeting in Niamey to urgently find a solution. Host President Mohamedou Issoufou says the frequency and sophistication of recent attacks is worrisome.
The scale of terrorist attacks are getting larger day after day. Terrorists are getting more sophisticated weapons. The terrorists have been real war professionals. They progress every day on the strategic, operative and tactical levels.
The G5 chairman appealed for a new strategy to face the growing threat.
We must work together to ensure victory against terrorism in the short, middle and long term. As the case in other countries fighting terrorism, we need allies, an alliance characterized with responsibility, cooperation and respect for each other.
At the end of the meeting, the leaders resolved to work together to fight the armed groups, which until now has been largely carried out by national armies.
Leaders have agreed to improve cooperation between national forces, joint military operations and international allies, as well as better coordination on both a political and strategic level. They've also agreed on information sharing between security institutions in their countries to better fight terrorism.
Earlier, the leaders paid their respect at the graves of 71 Niger soldiers killed last week when fighters linked to ISIL overran their base in Inates. More than 230 soldiers have been killed in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger over the past 4 months, in addition to 13 French troops who died in mid-air helicopter collision while hunting for the fighters. In the Lake Chad region, Boko Haram and its ISIL affiliates have carried out attacks on regional armies and executed civilians, raising concerns of more violence in the coming weeks and months. The G5 leaders have concluded their summit, but their citizens living on the front lines are desperate for help. For now, though, it's not clear if the resolutions of the summit will do that.
Well, let's take a closer look at some of the groups operating in the Sahel. There are 4 main armed groups in the region: ISIL, Boko Haram, a powerful group called Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, and Ansarul Islam. Both are Al Qaeda affiliates. They operate in northern Burkina Faso on the border with Mali. The group ISIL in the Greater Sahara has been launching attacks in Niger since the end of 2016. Boko Haram and ISIL in West Africa still operate from northeastern Nigeria near the border with Niger and Chad. And with the defeat of ISIL in Iraq, they are concerned some of its fighters may move through Libya and on to the Sahel. Well, let's bring in our guests now. In Paris, Marie-Roger Biloa, President and CEO of the Africa International Media Group. And joining us on Skype from Oslo, Stig Jarl Hansen, author of Horn, Sahel and Rift, fault lines of the African jihad. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Marie-Roger Biloa in Paris. The crisis in the Sahel is not an African crisis that's been ignored by the rest of the world. Quite the contrary. There are currently 17,000 international troops in the region to deal with the threats posed by armed groups. Why has it been so difficult to contain the violence?
That's exactly the question everybody is asking now. While France has been acclaimed when it intervened in 2013 to save Bamako, it has led to the head of states, or let's say the Malian head of state and Malian power, to be disenfranchised. And the goal was first to stop the jihadists and then to reinforce the military power, the military capacity of Mali and the countries concerned. But what has happened is that there was a huge distrust in the capacity of Mali to handle the situation. And it was like as if the French troops there were there to solve their own security issue. Because when you listen to the rhetoric, they say, we have to be there. Last time they said maybe 30 years, because we have to make sure the jihadists are not spilling over to Europe, which will lead to more migrations and more danger to Europe. So they have appropriated, there's a problem of ownership of the situation by the Europeans, forgetting that in first line, the Africans are the victims, are the first people to suffer and to be concerned with it are Africans. So because of that mindset, all the problems you can describe or determine are stemming from that.
Stig Hansen in Oslo, as Marie-Roger says, the presence of foreign troops hasn't really improved the security situation. In fact, the number of security incidents rose threefold in the region as compared to previous years, this year in 2019, specifically in Burkina Faso and in Niger. Why do you think we're seeing this upsurge in violence now? And how have armed groups like ISIL or Al Qaeda been able to get a foothold in this region and cause so much chaos?
No, there are several reasons why we see this upsurge. And the previous participant was correctly right that this was in one sense seen as a military problem, but it's in many ways also a local problem. And one of the things that I think is important here is we see some of these groups taking advantage of local animosities that has been neglected in the work against these groups in the past. If you look into the expansion into the Mopti region, we can see pastoralist farmer conflicts that some of these groups actively try to take advantage of. The same thing to a certain extent within Burkina Faso, a tension within some ethnic groups and also a tension between the center and the periphery. These other areas was neglected too long. We only looked at the north of Mali as the epicenter here, while you have these other dynamics, local conflicts that can be taken advantage of outside of that area. And what we see now is a blowback of such a strategy. You also need to emphasize local peacemaking and peacemaking between ethnic groups at the local level in order to avoid jihadists taking advantage of it.
Just to clarify, Stig, I just want to pick up on that. Just to clarify, you mentioned the Mopti region in Mali. And of course, you've had in Mali a conflict between farmers and nomadic Fulani herders. Is that the cause, the reason why Al Qaeda, Boko Haram and ISIL are strengthening their foothold, or rather a consequence of it?
No, I think it's a cause. And in the case of Mopti, it's a cause for their strengthening their foothold to a certain extent in Mopti, but also having more of a stepping stone into Burkina Faso. But there's other dynamics working around as well. The Nigerian case has also different dynamics. There's a lack of security provided in the countryside, and it allows the Islamic State in West Africa to prey on many of the villagers. And we've seen over and over again now that the central government has said that this group is on the verge of defeat, but we see them coming back all the time, also because security is not provided at the local level. And that's something that we have neglected, and that's to a certain extent also neglected within the Malian context.
Right. Marie-Roger Biloa, what do you see as the root causes of this crisis? What's driving the violence and an upsurge, in fact, in the violence in this year, 2019?
Okay. Well, one external factor, as we know, is the situation in Libya, due to all the weaponry which could spill over to the south, those countries to help jihadists. That's one of the big issues. And the second issue, as I said, is that when you cannot solve the problem without the Africans, without focusing on the African context. We all need international support. But as we say, we speak of support. You cannot solve that problem without empowering the armies. Let me give you one example.
But the armies have been empowered, have they not, Marie-Roger? Sorry to interrupt you. You talk about empowering the armies. The armies have been... What about the G5 Sahel force, which was established in 2017? Why hasn't it been able to take on the challenge? Is it due to a lack of resources, or is there something else?
Before the lack of resources, you know, the G5 Sahel is made of national armies. I mean, elements from national armies. But let me tell you something. You have an example of Mali, the army in Mali. You know, have officers. They don't even know how many troops they have in one unit. Some of the soldiers don't even have weapons. When you have military camps which are not guarded during the prayers or during lunch or whatever. You know, it's such a situation where you have the feeling that the Barkhane or all the international forces there, MINUSMA, they believe they can solve the problem because the Malian army, the Malian troops are not in a position to do that. Instead of empowering them, it was necessary when they had the big crisis in 2013 to just stop the jihadists because the Malian could not do that.
Right.
And then to build up the armies, they did not do that. They have not done that.
Right.
The second element is that I totally agree that we have to focus on Africa and the context of Africa. Of course, when you have looming conflicts and then you have that external jihadist force, the situation is very ripe to become worse. And so if you really want to do something about it, you don't just bring money and think of security and military and weaponry. You need to really tackle social issues and development issues.
And we'll get into that in just a few minutes, Marie-Roger.
And we don't really see something happening in that front.
Yeah, we'll get into the solutions in just a few minutes, if we can. Stig, let me ask you about this G5 Sahel force and its effectiveness or lack of effectiveness, as many would say. It's been set up now since 2017. Can this G5 experiment, in your view, work in a region that's crowded by sometimes competing military and domestic interests?
No, I think, the resources are weak for these forces, but there's another issue that is important here also, and it's about local service provision and local ownership. You know, you need a tradition to provide security at the local level. And in several of these conflicts, the army is not necessarily seen as neutral. It's seen as a tool of a center that lacks legitimacy, both in Mali and to a certain extent in Burkina Faso. So you need a comprehensive, basically, dialogue between some of these conflict parties. And that's very important. If you don't address that, you can build up the capacity. They will not have local legitimacy. So you need local support. And sometimes I think you need to delegate some of these responsibilities at the local level as well, because these areas are large and you need some kind of force and multiplicator. Of course, what's important in relations to some of these armies is a past where you have somewhat tattered human rights record, which also alienates the army towards some of the local populations. So you need to take into considerations this confidence building service provision on behalf of the army in relations to the locals around in the Sahel, and also indeed strongly in northern Nigeria. And you need to take into considerations human rights training as well in order to gain this legitimacy that can make all the good forces, also tribal forces that are on the good side of and working against the jihadis, stand together and tie them together. There's a lot of allies there. The problem has been to get them working together, basically. And that's not only state allies, but there's also non-state actors that can be potential allies there.
And speaking of allies and alliances, Stig, there have been a few reports recently that some of these armed groups are actually joining forces in this region. To what extent is that happening? And do they have shared goals and shared territories at this stage?
No, we see no, but that might be a sign of weakness. What we've seen over the last year is was the so-called Islamic State in Greater Sahara, who was operating in the border zone between Niger and Mali. It has been basically included into the Islamic State of Western Africa. And there's a lot of speculations why. It might be that the Islamic State centrally want stronger control. And definitively, the former Boko Haram fraction of the Islamic State in West Africa is stronger than the old Islamic State in Greater Sahara. But we don't know really what this cooperation means so far. We don't know if it's directly controlled, if it's just a name. What we can see, though, is that the Islamic State in West Africa, the former part that was Islamic State in Greater Sahara, has become much more efficient in the border areas between Mali and Niger. We can see larger scale attacks coming from that organization against also larger military formations now.
All right, Marie-Roger Biloa, as you've said, neither negotiations nor military operations have managed to restore security. So what else needs to happen at this stage, and how can the international community secure the Sahel?
Okay, what the international community needs to do is really to share the burden. And the burden is not just to believe that, not to trust the Africans. Of course, it's easy to believe that they are not in a position to, that their armies are weak. All this is true. But how do you believe that you can be there as an occupation army or whatever, a cooperation army for decades without helping the Africans to defend themselves? That's one of the points, because what we see today is that G5 Sahel was founded in 2014. The first decision they made to, for funding was it took them 3 years for funding. And now, when you speak about funding, money alone is not enough. You need to have a plan to really empower the army, the individual armies. I really insist on that. That's one of the strong conclusions we came at when we were studying there. You need individual armies to be structures, to be so that they can cooperate with others. Because when you just say coordinate, what do you coordinate? You coordinate troops who cannot work together, where you have political problems, which were alluded to, ethnic problems, whatever. You have to focus on all these things. I think the main focus, I repeat it, is Africa. You say the problem is happening in Africa. We are very glad that Europeans feel concerned and that they feel solidarity. They say if there's chaos there, Europe will be impacted, and that's why they're interfering, and that's positive. They are being sharing. The predicament with the Africans.
But how much longer do you think that could
dominate?
go on for,
and I tell you, there was.
How much longer do you think that can go on for? France, for instance, has suffered heavy losses in this crisis. How much longer can we expect somebody like President Macron to be committed in light of some of the opposition he's facing at home?
Oh, you know, they are not at all decided to leave. The chief of staff said they will be there maybe 30 years because there will not be a victory day. It's a long process. So they said that after they lost a lot of troops, I think 14 or 17, I don't
13,
remember,
yes,
sorry,
yeah.
a couple of weeks ago. So they are not, the decision is not to leave because they strongly feel that it's their duty and that the security of Europe will be impacted if the Sahel region stay in a chaos. So I don't think the problem is there. The problem is the acceptance of Africans of the international troops. There were problems, as you said, there were demonstrations along the route, women saying our husbands are dying, why are the French here? They have so much money and so much power and nothing is being improved. And then President Macron said, okay, I need all these not all these head of state to come to Po and to tell me what they want to do. And it was a very bad reaction. They don't feel that. France has to summon the people to come, the African head of state to come and summon, because the first people to be concerned are the Africans.
Right.
And,
but I think that meeting in Po that you talk about is still going to happen, in fact, in early 2020, in January 2020. That meeting between African leaders and the French president is going to happen in Po still.
Absolutely.
Let me bring in Stig.
There were a lot of discussion.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Let me bring back Stig into the conversation. Stig, as Marie-Roger Biloa said, money alone is not enough. But a number of countries have committed large aid budgets to the Sahel, concerned about poverty and climate change, for instance. And yes, yet it's proving difficult to provide effective public services or grassroots economic development to the region. What needs to happen? The aid and the promises are there. So what else has to happen?
You know, when I listened to the previous speaker, I so much agree with her with the African profile and the African emphasis. But I'm a little bit afraid also that we overemphasize these armies. You know, you need to have local legitimacies for these armies. Otherwise, you will fail utterly. We need to have local support. And then the armies need to be seen as neutral. They need to be providing security at the local level. One of the big mistakes we've done is to leave areas to the control of some of these extremist organizations. We have these fast forces, including the French forces, who can defeat, for example, Janim and the Islamic State in open battles, but they don't provide village security, leaving them to a kind of semi-territorial control that I write about in my latest book of some of these jihadist actors. And we have also these local conflicts, like the pastoral conflict with the nomadic population in Mopti that needs to be addressed. And here, the army hasn't been very efficient at all. You know, it's partly seen as an actor and partly not seen as doing its job. So we need to emphasize not only on building up these armies, but we need to emphasize on building up the legitimacy of these armies as well as their human rights records, as well as building up a perception of them being neutral. Otherwise, that won't simply be efficient. But I so much agree that these solutions have to be local, but you need to look into local legitimacy. That's very important. And if we don't do that, we will see things going in the wrong direction still.
The solutions have to be local, but also with help, Stig, from the international community. What else, what other support can the international community provide at this stage?
The international community can do local conflict resolution, for example, in the Mopti and also Burkina Faso. Of course, there could be service provision, supported service provision at the local level, but conflict resolution, that needs to be done, and maybe it has been neglected, and it should be especially emphasis in these areas where it looks like these groups can expand into. So Burkina Faso and also Mopti, this is very important. Unfortunately, sometimes it's risks involved, and that makes some of the international actors shun away, but we need grassroots reconciliation in some of these areas combined with security efforts.
Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. Marie-Roger Biloa, Stig J. Hansen, thank you both for being on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Foli Batibo, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.